May 4th, 2026. The United States Central Command officially launches an operation called Project Freedom, and within hours, the entire character of the fight over the Strait of Hormuz changes completely. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth confirmed the following day that more than 100 American aircraft were actively participating, roughly the same number already supporting the ongoing naval blockade of Iran running in parallel. Admiral Brad Cooper, the commander of Central Command, told reporters the operation involved A-10 Thunderbolts, F-15s, F-16s, and F-35s, unmanned drones, RC-135 signals intelligence aircraft, and Air Force tankers, keeping the whole formation fueled and airborne. 15,000 American service members were tied into the effort. Ballistic missile defense-capable destroyers sat offshore. Multi-domain unmanned platforms operated simultaneously under the sea, on the surface, and in the air. And here's the detail that tells you everything about what actually happened once this entire apparatus flipped on. Admiral Cooper, a man who by his own account had personally transited the Strait of Hormuz somewhere around 100 times across his career, said that on a normal day, you'd typically see somewhere between 20 and 40 small Iranian boats swarming out to harass or threaten passing shipping. On the day Project Freedom actually went live, 6 boats showed up, and American forces eliminated every single one of them almost immediately. Sit with the mechanics of that outcome for a moment, because the scale of the mismatch really is the whole story here. This wasn't a case of the United States simply deploying more firepower and winning a straightforward exchange of fire. It was a case of the entire expected shape of the confrontation collapsing before it ever really began. Iranian naval doctrine in that strait had been built, tested, and refined across years of exactly these kinds of harassment operations. Small, fast boats fanning out from multiple ports simultaneously, converging on a target from several directions at once, betting that sheer volume would overwhelm whatever single ship or aircraft happened to be in position to respond. On the day that doctrine actually needed to hold up against a fully activated American surveillance and defense network, it produced 6 boats instead of dozens, and none of them survived contact. That's not a marginal tactical setback. That's the kind of outcome that gets studied and picked apart inside every naval planning office paying attention to this war, on every side of it. Let's slow down and actually walk through why that gap between 20 to 40 boats and 6 boats matters so much, because the raw number alone doesn't tell the full story without understanding exactly what changed underneath it. 20 to 40 boats on a normal day, according to the man who's actually made that transit himself 100 times. 6 boats showed up the day the United States actually flipped on its full surveillance and defensive network. Cooper himself, in that same press conference, called it a clear example of the degradation of Iran's naval capability, careful to add that it didn't mean the threat was entirely gone, just that it had been, in his own words, highly degraded. That's not spin from a press office trying to manufacture a victory narrative. That's an operational commander looking at real-time numbers and telling reporters directly that whatever the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps thought it still had in the Strait of Hormuz clearly wasn't there anymore, or at least wasn't there in anything close to the volume anyone expected going into that operation. To understand why this specific moment mattered so much, you have to rewind through everything that led up to it, because the Strait of Hormuz has been the single most contested piece of water on the planet for months at this point. When the wider war between the United States, Israel, and Iran broke out at the end of February, Iran's response, once its own supreme leader and dozens of senior officials had been killed in the opening wave of strikes, was to close the strait entirely, cutting off a corridor that, under normal circumstances, carries roughly a quarter of the entire world's seaborne oil trade and around a fifth of global liquefied natural gas shipments. That's not a regional inconvenience, that's a direct hit to the global economy. And it's exactly why the United States treated reopening that waterway as one of its top operational priorities almost immediately. On March 19th, the United States launched what eventually became known as the Strait of Hormuz campaign, a sustained aerial effort specifically targeting Iranian naval vessels and drones that Tehran had positioned to enforce its own closure. That campaign notched a genuinely significant early success when Israeli forces assassinated Alireza Tangsiri, the senior naval officer who had been personally overseeing Iran's blockade of the strait. Removing the specific commander responsible for coordinating that blockade wasn't just a symbolic win. It created exactly the kind of command and control gap that becomes almost impossible to fully repair in the middle of an active, fast-moving conflict. Consider what a role like that actually requires from the person holding it. Coordinating mine, laying operations, fast boat deployments, and coastal missile positioning across an entire stretch of contested coastline demands institutional knowledge that doesn't transfer cleanly to a replacement overnight. Relationships with local commanders, familiarity with the specific geography and choke points of the strait, and an understanding of exactly how far the regime in Tehran was willing to let its naval forces push before political considerations overruled purely military ones. Losing that person to a targeted strike doesn't just remove one name from an organizational chart. It removes an entire accumulated body of operational judgment right at the moment an adversary is actively probing for weaknesses. Whoever inherited that role inside the IRGC Navy was necessarily working with a steeper learning curve than their predecessor. At the exact same time, the United States was quietly assembling the far more sophisticated surveillance architecture that would eventually become Project Freedom. By April 13th, after diplomatic talks held in Islamabad failed to produce a workable resolution, the United States flipped the entire dynamic on its head, imposing its own full naval blockade against Iran, intercepting vessels attempting to enter or leave Iranian ports. According to figures from Central Command, that blockade eventually intercepted more than 85 vessels, seized 3 ships outright, and, according to American estimates, cost Iran roughly $500 million a day in lost trade. Iran, in retaliation, seized 2 cargo ships of its own, and on April 23rd, President Trump directly ordered the Navy to destroy any Iranian vessel caught laying mines anywhere near the strait, a direct response to Iran's pattern of scattering sea mines across the waterway to make transit as dangerous as possible for anyone who tried it anyway. It's worth putting those blockade numbers in proper context, because they explain exactly why both sides kept escalating rather than backing down in the weeks before Project Freedom launched. 85 vessels intercepted is a genuinely enormous logistical undertaking, requiring constant surveillance of every ship approaching Iranian waters, boarding teams ready to act on short notice, and the diplomatic willingness to accept the friction that comes with stopping commercial traffic on a sustained basis. 3 ships seized outright represents an even more serious escalation, since seizing a vessel typically means holding its crew and cargo, a move that carries real legal and diplomatic risk under international maritime law. And that $500 million our daily cost figure, even accounting for the fact that it came from American estimates rather than an independent audit, gives you a sense of just how much financial pressure was actively being applied to the Iranian economy every single day that blockade remained in place. Shipping analysts at the time noted that a small number of vessels, reportedly around 26, according to one tracking service, still managed to bypass the blockade entirely. A reminder that even a genuinely comprehensive naval operation rarely achieves total, airtight control over every possible route in and out of a country's coastline. So, by the time May rolled around, you had months of escalating back and forth naval conflict, missile strikes, boat sinkings, blockades, and counter-blockades, all centered on this single narrow stretch of water. And that's exactly the environment Project Freedom was designed to break through. Because here's the thing nobody had really tried yet at that point in the war. Every previous American effort to deal with the strait had been fundamentally reactive, responding to Iranian mines, responding to Iranian boat swarms, responding to specific missile launches as they happened. Project Freedom flipped that model completely, building what Admiral Cooper repeatedly described as a defensive umbrella, a comprehensive, layered surveillance and protection network stretched across the entire strait, rather than a series of individual reactive responses. Let's actually break down what that umbrella consisted of, because the specific mix of assets involved tells you exactly why the IRGC ended up so completely caught off guard. Start with the RC-135 signals intelligence aircraft, planes whose entire job is to sweep up electronic emissions across a wide area, radar signals, radio communications, anything transmitting that can be intercepted and analyzed. Layer on top of that, the Air Force fighters, the A-10s, F-15s, F-16s, and F-35s, each one bringing different capabilities to the mix. The A-10 built for close air support and specifically effective against fast-moving gunboats, exactly like the ones the IRGC likes to swarm shipping lanes with. The F-15s and F-16s equipped and postured to shoot down Iranian drones before they ever reach a target. Then you've got the unmanned drones providing persistent surveillance, watching the water continuously rather than only during scheduled patrol windows. Underneath all of that, multi-domain unmanned platforms operating below the surface, on the surface, and in the air simultaneously, essentially blanketing every physical layer of the strait with some form of automated or semi-automated monitoring. And then, quietly sitting above the entire operation, according to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, space operators were actively supporting the effort as well, though officials declined to specify exactly which orbital systems were involved. It's worth pausing on just how unusual it is for officials to even acknowledge that space-based assets were tied into a tactical naval operation like this one, let alone have the chairman of the Joint Chiefs personally confirm it in a public briefing. Space-based surveillance typically operates in the background of these kinds of stories, supporting broader strategic awareness rather than getting directly credited for a specific tactical outcome in a contested strait. The fact that officials chose to publicly connect Project Freedom's results back to space operations, even while declining to specify which systems were actually involved, tells you the Pentagon wanted this particular success attributed to the full breadth of the American surveillance architecture, not just the visible aircraft and ships doing the actual fighting on the day. That's a deliberate messaging choice, and it reinforces the broader point of the entire operation, that this was never really about a single dramatic strike or a single impressive dogfight. It was about demonstrating an entirely integrated system working across every available domain simultaneously. Think about what that combination actually produces when you stack it all together. It's not simply more firepower pointed at the strait, though there was plenty of that too. It's comprehensive, layered awareness, a picture of everything moving on, above and below the water's surface, updated continuously and cross-referenced against electronic signals intelligence, sweeping the entire area. Admiral Cooper described it directly, saying the arrangement included multiple layers spanning ships, helicopters, aircraft, airborne early warning, and electronic warfare, explicitly contrasting it against the kind of one-for-one tanker escort approach the United States had used back in the 1980s during an earlier round of tension in these same waters. Back then, you'd assign a single Navy vessel to shadow a single commercial tanker through the danger zone. Project Freedom threw that model out entirely in favor of something closer to a total surveillance and interdiction net stretched across the whole waterway at once. And that's precisely why the IRGC got caught so flat-footed. Every single one of Iran's naval tactics in this conflict has depended fundamentally on numbers and coordination, sending out swarms of small, fast, cheap boats loaded with rockets, machine guns, or limpet mines, overwhelming a target through sheer volume and simultaneous approach angles that a single defending vessel simply can't track and respond to all at once. That's the entire logic behind the 20 to 40 boat swarms Admiral Cooper described as the historical norm. You can't stop 40 small boats coming at you from every direction with one ship and one crew, no matter how well trained they are. But you absolutely can stop that same swarm if you already know exactly where every single one of those boats launched from, what heading they're on, and what their intent is before they've even cleared their own harbor. Because now instead of 40 simultaneous threats you're reacting to in real time, you're dealing with 40 targets you've already tracked, categorized, and prioritized well before they ever became a genuine threat to anything. Think of it like the difference between defending a house against a surprise break-in versus defending it when you already know exactly which window somebody's going to try, what time they're planning to try it, and how many people are coming. The physical threat hasn't necessarily gotten any smaller in either scenario, but the entire calculus of defending against it changes completely once surprise and simultaneity get taken out of the equation. Iran's fast boat swarms were never really about raw firepower. Individually, these are small, lightly armed vessels that pose limited danger to a well-defended target on their own. Their entire value came from arriving all at once, from multiple directions, faster than a defender could process and respond to each individual threat. Strip that surprise away with a surveillance net comprehensive enough to see every boat leaving port in real time, and you've effectively disarmed the tactic before a single shot ever gets fired. That's the fundamental shift Project Freedom represented, and it's exactly why the operation targeted something more foundational than just the boats and missiles themselves. This wasn't primarily about destroying more Iranian hardware in a single strike. It was about denying the IRGC the specific advantage its entire strategy depended on, the ability to coordinate a mass, simultaneous, multi-vector assault against a target before the defending side had time to fully sort out what was actually happening. Once you strip away that element of surprise and coordination, an Iranian fast boat swarm stops being a genuinely terrifying tactical problem and starts looking a lot more like 40 individually trackable, individually vulnerable small vessels with essentially no armor and minimal defensive capability of their own. Let's talk about the psychological dimension of this too, because it matters just as much as the pure technical capability involved. Every Iranian naval officer operating in that strait had spent months, arguably years, training and planning around a specific assumption that overwhelming numbers and simultaneous multi-directional attacks would always create more targets than any single American response could handle. That assumption had held up reasonably well across earlier phases of the conflict, forcing the United States into that reactive posture of responding to individual mine layings, individual boat harassment incidents, individual missile launches one at a time. Project Freedom shattered that assumption in a single operational rollout. When only 6 boats showed up instead of the expected 20 to 40, and every one of them got eliminated almost immediately, that's not just a tactical defeat, that's a fundamental collapse of the entire doctrine the IRGC had built its Hormuz strategy around. You can rebuild lost boats. Rebuilding the operational confidence of a naval force that just watched its signature swarm tactic get neutralized before it could even properly form up is a much harder problem, and it's exactly the kind of psychological blow that tends to linger long after the physical hardware losses get replaced. Here's the honesty check worth applying to all of this, because it's important not to overstate what a single operation, however impressive, actually accomplished in the broader arc of this war. Admiral Cooper himself was careful to frame the reduced boat numbers as evidence of degradation, not elimination. Iran still retained a meaningful naval capability heading into May, still had access to sea mines, still had coastal missile batteries tucked into hillsides along its southern coast, and still had a demonstrated willingness to test American resolve repeatedly across the preceding months of this conflict. Project Freedom represented a single dramatic operational rollout of a genuinely new defensive architecture, and the initial results were undeniably lopsided in America's favor. But a single successful transit operation involving a couple of commercial ships, as impressive as the underlying technology and coordination clearly were, still needed to scale up into something sustaining a steady, reliable stream of commercial traffic before anyone could reasonably call the strait genuinely reopened for normal global shipping. Analysts covering the rollout at the time made almost exactly that point, cautioning that it would likely take real time for commercial shipping companies. Having watched months of mines, boat attacks, and blockades play out in these exact waters, to actually feel safe enough to resume normal transit patterns, regardless of how comprehensive the American defensive umbrella genuinely was on paper. That caution deserves real weight, because commercial shipping decisions rarely track one-to-one with military assessments. A tanker company's insurance underwriters, its own internal risk committees, and the crews who actually have to sail through the strait all operate on a different, generally more conservative timeline than a Pentagon press briefing announcing a successful operational rollout. Even a genuinely dominant military outcome on a single given day doesn't automatically translate into insurers lowering premiums or shipping lines resuming full schedules the following week. Rebuilding that kind of commercial confidence typically requires a sustained track record, weeks or months of consistently safe transits, before the actual economic behavior of global shipping fully catches up to whatever the underlying military reality has already become. That gap between battlefield success and market confidence is exactly the kind of friction that tends to get lost in the headlines celebrating a dramatic operational rollout like this one. That gap between a single strong day and a fully proven strategic shift is exactly the kind of nuance worth watching closely as more data comes in over the following weeks. There's also a broader financial and diplomatic backdrop worth understanding, because Project Freedom didn't launch in a vacuum. It launched directly into the aftermath of a failed diplomatic process. The Islamabad talks, an effort specifically aimed at ending the broader war and, by extension, resolving the standoff over the strait, had collapsed weeks earlier, which is precisely what triggered the American naval blockade against Iran in mid-April in the first place. So by the time Project Freedom rolled out in early May, both sides had already demonstrated a genuine willingness to escalate rather than negotiate their way through this specific choke point. Iran had shown it was prepared to accept the economic pain of a full blockade, an estimated $500 million a day according to American figures, rather than simply reopening the strait on Washington's terms. And the United States had shown it was prepared to build out an entirely new, far more sophisticated defensive architecture, rather than continuing to absorb the political and economic cost of leaving one of the world's most important waterways effectively closed. Let's think through the broader strategic logic behind targeting Iran's surveillance and coordination capability specifically, rather than simply matching Iran boat for boat or missile for missile in a straightforward war of attrition. Modern naval warfare, especially in a confined, geographically constrained space like the Strait of Hormuz, depends enormously on situational awareness. Whoever has the clearer, faster, more complete picture of what's actually happening on the water holds an enormous structural advantage, regardless of the raw number of holes either side can put in the water. Iran's entire swarm tactic was, in a sense, a workaround for not having that kind of superior awareness, using sheer numbers and multi-directional chaos to compensate for the fact that Iranian commanders generally couldn't outsee or out-coordinate a technologically superior opponent in a direct sensor-to-sensor contest. Project Freedom directly attacked that workaround by making sure American forces could see, track, and prioritize threats faster and more completely than Iran could ever hope to launch and coordinate them. Once that gap in situational awareness opened up wide enough, the entire swarm strategy stopped functioning as designed, because a swarm only works if it actually arrives as a swarm, overwhelming the defender's ability to process multiple simultaneous threats. Strip away the element of surprise and simultaneity, and you're just left with a small number of individually exposed boats that never should have launched in the first place. Let's also talk about what this specific moment says about the trajectory of the broader war, because Project Freedom wasn't an isolated tactical success, sitting apart from everything else happening across this conflict. It came directly on the heels of the assassination of Iran's senior naval commander overseeing the blockade weeks earlier, which means the IRGC was already operating with a meaningful gap in its command structure by the time this new, far more sophisticated American surveillance architecture went live. Losing your top naval coordinator and then, weeks later, watching your entire signature swarm tactic get exposed and neutralized in a single operational rollout is exactly the kind of compounding pressure that tends to erode not just physical capability, but institutional confidence and coherence within a military organization. Whoever stepped into that command gap left by Tong Siri's death was inheriting a Navy that had just been shown, in the most direct and public way possible, that its central operational doctrine no longer worked against the specific defensive posture the United States had built. Here's another layer worth adding to the analysis, because it connects Project Freedom directly back to the broader economic war being waged alongside the military one. Every day the strait stayed closed or heavily restricted, Iran was hemorrhaging roughly $500 million according to American estimates, money that would otherwise have flowed from oil exports directly into the regime's coffers. Every successful transit under the new defensive umbrella chipped away at Iran's ability to use that closure as leverage in any future negotiation. Because the entire point of closing the strait in the first place was to inflict enough global economic pain that the pressure to reopen it would eventually outweigh Iran's political appetite for continued confrontation. If the United States could demonstrate repeatedly and reliably that commercial shipping could move safely through the strait despite Iran's closure, that fundamentally undermines the entire premise of using the waterway as a bargaining chip. Project Freedom wasn't just a military operation, it was also a direct assault on Iran's primary source of economic and diplomatic leverage in this entire conflict. Let's zoom out one more time and think about what this specific operation teaches us about how modern naval conflicts and contested choke points are likely to unfold going forward, well beyond just this one war. For decades, the conventional wisdom around narrow, heavily trafficked waterways like the Strait of Hormuz assumed that a determined, asymmetric actor with enough small boats, mines, and missiles could always impose real cost and real risk on a technologically superior navy simply by generating chaos and volume faster than any single defending force could process it. Project Freedom represents a genuine test of whether that conventional wisdom still holds once you introduce the kind of comprehensive, multi-domain, space-supported surveillance architecture the United States rolled out here. The early results suggest that gap between raw numbers and genuine situational dominance has narrowed dramatically, at least against an adversary like Iran that doesn't have its own comparable space-based or signals intelligence infrastructure to contest that picture in return. That's not a universal law of naval warfare. An adversary with its own robust satellite and electronic warfare capability might respond very differently to this exact same defensive umbrella. But against the specific mix of assets Iran had available in the Strait of Hormuz in the spring of 2026, the mismatch turned out to be significant enough that a force expecting to send out its usual 20 to 40 boat swarm ended up managing only 6, and lost every single one of them almost immediately. Let's also give proper weight to just how quickly this entire defensive architecture came together, because building genuine multi-domain integration, aircraft, ships, submarines, space assets, and unmanned platforms across every physical layer of a contested waterway, all coordinated into a single coherent operational picture, is an enormously difficult logistical and technical challenge under the best of circumstances. Doing it in the middle of an active, ongoing shooting war, with 15,000 service members tied into the effort and over 100 aircraft flying coordinated missions, represents a genuinely impressive feat of military organization, regardless of how you feel about the broader political and strategic questions surrounding this entire conflict. That kind of rapid, large-scale operational pivot doesn't happen by accident. It reflects months of prior planning, positioning, and asset allocation that had clearly been building toward exactly this kind of moment well before Project Freedom's official launch date on May 4th. It's also worth acknowledging just how many different branches and specialties had to mesh together seamlessly to make an operation like this actually function on day one. Air Force fighters and tankers working alongside Navy destroyers and unmanned undersea platforms, signals intelligence crews feeding real-time data into a shared operational picture, space-based assets contributing without ever being publicly detailed, and 15,000 individual service members, all executing their specific piece of a much larger, tightly synchronized whole. Military history is full of examples where individual branches struggled to share information and coordinate effectively even during planned exercises, let alone live combat operations against an adaptive adversary. The fact that Project Freedom apparently came together this cleanly on essentially its first operational day suggests the planning and rehearsal that went into building this defensive architecture had been underway for considerably longer than the relatively short window between the naval blockade's launch in mid-April and Project Freedom's own debut just a few weeks later in early May. So where does this leave things looking forward from that initial rollout? The reduced boat numbers and the speed of their elimination gave American commanders real, on the ground, evidence that Iran's naval capability in the strait had been meaningfully degraded, but degraded is not the same as eliminated. And the broader pattern of this entire war, months of escalation followed by temporary pauses, followed by renewed provocation, suggests Iran was unlikely to simply accept that setback and stand down permanently. The real test of Project Freedom was never going to be a single successful transit of a couple of commercial vessels under heavy military escort. It was whether that defensive umbrella could actually scale into something durable enough to convince ordinary commercial shipping companies, the tanker operators and container lines that make the actual economic case for the strait mattering in the first place, that regular transit had become safe and predictable again, after months of mines, missile strikes, and boat swarms had made the entire waterway feel like a war zone rather than a shipping lane. That distinction between a single dramatic day of overwhelming operational success and a genuinely durable, sustained reopening of one of the world's most important shipping lanes is really the frame worth carrying forward from this entire story. 6 boats eliminated on the first day of a new defensive posture tells you an enormous amount about the immediate gap in surveillance and coordination between the two sides at that specific moment. It tells you far less about whether that gap holds steady over the following weeks and months, whether Iran finds a workaround, or whether global shipping companies ultimately decide the risk has actually dropped enough to justify resuming business as usual through a stretch of water that had spent the better part of a year as one of the most dangerous transit corridors on the planet. I want to know what you think about how significant this specific shift actually turns out to be in the bigger picture of this conflict. Do you think Project Freedom represents a genuine, lasting turning point in how the United States controls contested waterways like Hormuz going forward? Or do you think Iran simply needed time to adapt its tactics around this new surveillance-heavy defensive posture before testing it again? Drop your thoughts down in the comments, because there's a real debate here about how much a single dramatic operational rollout, however impressive the underlying technology and coordination clearly were, actually changes the fundamental balance of power in a conflict that's already proven itself capable of dragging on far longer than anyone initially expected. If this breakdown helped you understand exactly what changed the moment that Defensive Umbrella went live, go ahead and hit that like button. It genuinely helps put detailed operational analysis like this in front of more people trying to follow how this entire naval standoff has actually evolved, rather than just catching isolated headlines about strikes and blockades. And if you want to keep following how the fight over the Strait of Hormuz continues to play out, because this clearly wasn't the final chapter of that story, go ahead and subscribe, because there's a lot more of this conflict still left to unpack. Thanks so much for watching all the way through, and I'll see you in the next one.